Thanks for joining for this episode of the TechSpective Podcast. My guest is Vivek Bhandari. Vivek, if you could provide a little bit of background on yourself and your role.
Absolutely. Hey, Tony. Well, thank you for having me on, and glad to be talking about some really important topics here related to the security industry. So my name is Vivek Bhandari. I've been associated with the security industry for a really long time, mostly on the vendor side. I've worked at a number of large and small companies building solutions to help customers address the risks and the threats that come from a lot of the cyber attacks. More recently, I'm currently at Tanium. I head up our product marketing function worldwide. And as part of that, I get a chance to really take to market a lot of the innovations that our engineering and product teams are putting together.
Okay, very cool. I think most people have heard of Tanium, but for anyone who might not know, could you give a brief overview of sort of, Tanium, its mission, what does Tanium do?
Yeah, absolutely. So Tanium was founded by David and Orion Hindavi, who were originally founders of BigFix. And BigFix is a endpoint management platform that they eventually sold to IBM. And they founded Tanium because one of the challenges they realized customers were struggling with was there were a number of endpoint management solutions, but the challenge as the endpoint estate kept growing, the ability to have real-time visibility and the ability to take actions at scale with a high degree of accuracy and again in real time was really something that customers were missing. And so David and Ryan put together Tanium, and they took almost 5 years to really perfect that client architecture, which is a patented technology. It's really the bedrock, the foundation on which Tanium is able to deliver real-time visibility, which is real-time visibility on all the different kinds of endpoints within an IT environment, having real-time access to the data, and then ability to take actions, whether it is doing cyber hygiene or basically remediating incidents, right? And so Tanium's a company that's been around since 2007. It services, majority of the global retailers, majority of the global top financials, the 5 departments of defense in the US, a lot of our allies, Ministry of Defenses and Department of Defenses around the world, Fortune 70 companies out of the top 100. So really broad-based install base that uses Tanium every day.
Okay. So one of the things that has been, I guess, one of the top topics in cybersecurity this year has been around software bill of materials. There's been directives from the Biden administration, from CISA, in terms of mandating that we have some sort of software bill of materials, ostensibly to help combat supply chain type attacks, and just kind of know it's almost like the requirement for ingredients labels on food products. It's like you need to know what's in this.
Yes.
So and I know that's an area that Tanium is focused on as well. So I guess to start things off in that regard, can you just kind of give a little background on what is a software bill of materials? Why is it considered such a critical component of cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's certainly a very rapidly evolving and a growing area of risk and concern for a lot of the security practitioners and organizations worldwide. So SBOM, or software bill of materials, Tony, as you mentioned, is really an ability for somebody to understand in a given environment or with a given piece of software, what are the different components of that software. So if you backtrack it a little bit, let's just define SBOM for our audience as well, right? SBOM really, in the simple words, if you look at the modern software architecture, right, one of the things that has really happened is with the advent of open source software, right? And of course, this is a long time ago. It has really unleashed a lot of productivity and innovation on the software creation side, right? For all the folks that are building software, either vendors like Tanium or even institutions and organizations that are building software for their own use, right? Financials, healthcare, every sort of segment of the industry. Now, the way we build software these days vast majority of that software is you're picking up components, right? You're taking, you want a web component here, the ability to print, the ability to log, audit. A lot of these common components are something that are very easy for people to just assemble, put your custom logic, business logic around whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish, and voila, there you got your application. Now, if you start thinking, just like if we were preparing a dish, you mix a whole bunch of ingredients from the kitchen, and you put together your dish. It's the same way the software is being put together, and there are all these components. Now, as the world has continued to digitize, we've got all this digitization is primarily, a lot of that is driven with software, right? I mean, you think no matter what kind of industry, or even if you're a car industry or manufacturing, software is gaining more and more, sort of prevalence in the environment. And so the software bill of material really helps customers understand what are the ingredients of the software. Now, why is it important? Tony, I think a good reminder of this is back in 2020, I think when we had a major, it was just before Christmas, people were getting ready to sort of enjoy the downtime and the holidays. And then all of a sudden we had this major zero-day vulnerability that got disclosed with Log4j, a very common software component that's used in a wide variety of software. And what that means really is somebody had discovered a gap, a weakness in Log4j, which is very commonly used, that can be exploited by attackers, right? They can exploit that weakness and effectively gives them a toehold in the endpoint or in the customers or any whatever organization environment by exploiting that weakness. When such a thing happens, there was back then, again, a lot of people had to spend through the holidays a lot of time trying to figure out where in their environment they had Log4j. But if you had an SBOM, a ready SBOM, let's say, you could very quickly look it up and say, hey, across my hundreds of thousands of endpoints across my complex IT environment, where do I have a Log4j? That is what effectively what people were trying to catalog. So they could understand where is it that we have a risk, and let's take some action to go sort of mitigate that risk. And that's what SBOM really does. It allows you to understand where a certain component of software is, and that component could be deeply embedded within a larger application stack.
Right. And I remember, when Log4j hit, one of the things is it's real easy if you have deployed Apache, and you can just say, oh, I'm running Apache, I probably have Log4j, like that part's easy. The harder part, and where the SBOM comes in, are like you said, the people who just kind of took the Log4j component and put it in something else. And so there's all these people out there around the world who are running things who just kind of take for granted that it kind of does the thing that it does, and might not even realize that under that is Log4j. That's what makes it work. So I think that it's an excellent excellent example. So I had said earlier that there's been attention given to SBOM from the government. CISA has provided some guidelines. I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of the key takeaways from CISA's recommendations, or how they help organizations when it comes to supply chain security.
I think CISA, as well as we have seen this from the White House, and a lot of the executive orders come out as well. One of the things we have realized is there's software, not just in industry, but a lot in the federal department, in the public sector, across our critical infrastructure as well. And that's certainly something that our government and CISA is deeply concerned about and wants to make sure that we are protecting it. Now, in order to most effectively protect that, there are certainly mandates and guidelines that have come out, right, both from the White House as well as from CISA. And it's really primarily to protect that sort of critical infrastructure as well as the public sector organizations, where they're effectively requiring, they realize that because attackers, and this includes nation state actors, are leveraging the different componentry of the software, which is really part of the software supply chain or the digital supply chain, as a way to get into different networks and organizations. And we have seen some really high profile attacks over the last 2-3 years that have leveraged that as a way to get in. CISA published guidelines, which basically is requiring effectively every software vendor that is supplying into the public sector to include a software bill of material. So for example, if Tanium has to sell into the public sector, we need to make sure that we include a software bill of material as part of our software stack. So the consuming organization is aware of all the different componentry that exists within there. So in case a future Log4j, and we've known there since even the Log4j, there have been quite a few, not 0-day, but certainly high profile and severity 1 vulnerabilities, whether it is OpenSSL that happened last year. More recently, curl was one thing that came up, right? Now, of course, the severity of that was downgraded as it finally sort of fully came out, but things like that will keep coming. And it allows the consuming organization to fully know what is in the componentry of that software, so that in the future, as and when these vulnerabilities get disclosed, they can know exactly where in their environment, which software has it, and look for remediation steps or mitigation steps against it. Right. Okay. So CISA is certainly taking a very active role in this, and I think rightfully so. They're trying to bring the industry together as well, and I think it'll certainly move the industry forward.
Well, and I think it's I guess worth mentioning that CISA does not directly have any authority over private sector organizations. It kind of comes back to what you just described, in that the Biden administration, the federal government, or CISA makes these frameworks of rules and requirements, and they say, hey, you know what, every federal agency has to do X, Y, Z. But then that ends up extending to, okay, but if you want to do business with us, you also must do X, Y, Z. And so even though they can't tell you what to do, it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling mandate of sorts, because most organizations either want to directly do business with governments, because it's a huge customer, or even indirectly, and it just has this ripple effect that that if CISA says, well, or federal organizations must have this, then it kind of becomes a mandate unofficially for the private sector.
I was surprised, Tony. It seems like less than maybe about 20% of these organizations that produce software today in the United States actually create a software bill of material, right? So we have a long ways to go in terms of this thing becoming a standard best practice among software creators. But there are challenges, right? It's not easy when you think about it, right? You have organizations that are creating software, but they are, as part of the creation process, they are pulling a whole bunch of components off the shelf. People come and go. You're creating patches, you're creating versions. So it's a constant state of evolution. It's a very dynamic environment, and the componentry is dynamic, right, as the software keeps evolving. But I think the practice of software creators or application creators continuing to sort of build SBOMs and ship with the application stack is going to continue to become mainstream over the years. It'll take us a few years as an industry. And when I say a few years, I think it's going to be north of 5-6 years before we really get to vast majority of the software vendors are actually including an SBOM. But the practice has certainly begun, and I think the mandates from CISA are certainly helping.
Yeah. Well, and my analogy earlier about comparing it to an ingredients list on a food product.
Yeah.
I feel like those things exist, like the basic concept of a bill of materials exists in almost every other place, whether we know it or not. Like, I think you mentioned, automobiles or whatever. It's like there is a supply chain there, and and even though you don't as the consumer, when you buy a car, get a list that says, hey, this is where we got the brake pads from, and this is where we got the power steering fluid from, but they know.
Yep.
And that way, when they start, if they find a defect in a product from a specific manufacturer, and then they can narrow that down to say, okay, well, we know that this lot during this time frame from this factory is bad. Let's go find all of the vehicles that affects. Or like when you see like an E. coli breakout from a romaine lettuce or whatever, they can track that back and say, okay, well, we know it happened from this farm, in this date range. Now let's go find all the places that lettuce went to after it left this farm. And all we're trying to do is kind of the same thing for software, to say, look, like when we do find a vulnerability, we need to be able to then say, okay, where did this vulnerability go after it left here?
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. I think those analogies are just so perfect, right? Like the practice of bill of material has existed in a lot of industries for a really long time. The concept of SBOM has also been around for a long time. It's just that now in the last few years, it's beginning to gain prominence because attackers are beginning to exploit that supply chain, right, as a way to sort of get into the environments, right? And I think a big component factor of this here, like as you said, right, like with that, whether it's a car manufacturer, I mean, I think a lot of this practice, even in I remember back even 10, 15, 20 years ago, electronic circuit boards that are used almost in everything these days. It was just the computers back then, but everything's become a computer now. So those electronic circuit boards that have like a bunch of these little diodes, a little microchip here, memory processor, and all kinds of componentry in there, bill of material is a very standard practice exactly for that same reason. So if something were to go wrong or not working correctly, you can trace it back to the suppliers and figure out how to fix it.
Right. But they and I think they're still dealing with, but there was just an incident recently in the airline industry where there was like there was a third-party parts manufacturer that they were getting parts from for the engine, and found out that that part is not actually a certified part, and now they've had to like go out and go to all the different airlines, Southwest, United, and say, hey, did you guys get any of these parts, because you shouldn't have these in your engines. And as someone who has just was on a plane yesterday, I appreciate that.
Totally.
So on the topic of SBOM, and like you said, a lot of organizations are not creating them now. I mean, it's not a standard practice, but Tanium has introduced a product specifically for generating SBOMs. So can you talk to some about that, and how the tool streamlines the SBOM process, and how that helps organizations?
Yes, absolutely. I think Tanium, as we are in the business of helping organizations effectively manage and secure their endpoints, we saw this trend emerge of software supply chain a few years ago. And given Tanium's strength of the ability to really understand endpoint data at scale in real time and analyze it, it was just a very natural extension for us to be able to add, in addition to all the deep visibility we provide, the ability to also add software bill of material to our capabilities. And the reason why it became so important was not only because a lot of software vendors don't include SBOMs, right? So let's break this problem, I think, into two parts. One is you have the supply side, right? The organizations that are producing software and selling it to other organizations. And then you've got the consumers, organizations that are actually using the software. Now, when you think about from a user perspective and using organization, they're procuring software from many different sources, right? You take any large organization, you've got, from several dozen, if not several hundred different sort of software suppliers within an environment that one is using. Now, when you think about it, right, if you're a CISO or responsible for securing an organization and you've got literally dozens or hundreds of software suppliers, because think about it, even a little browser sitting on a desktop is a piece of software, which is made up of a lot of different components. Then you've got your different application components. You've got all different sort of applications for business, whether you're running it in your own private infrastructure, in your private cloud or in the public cloud, different apps that are running on the local machine. There's just a lot of software. Now, some of these may supply you a software bill of material, but a lot of them don't. And even if they did, think about it. If you've got this ingredient list from 100, 200, 300 different sort of vendors that you get, right? Now you have to compile it, put it all together, and you have to be able to track in real time, this particular server here or this particular user machine, what is on it at any given point in time. It's a really hard problem, right? So Log4j example that we spoke about, even today, Tony, organizations are getting nailed with the Log4j vulnerability. And it just speaks to the complexity of the problem, because it is so hard to know exactly where in your environment Log4j is. And for that reason, we created software bill of material that allows organizations to, at runtime, dynamically generate a software bill of material across the enterprise, across all pieces of software, and be able to sort of inventory that and know what's running at any given endpoint in real time. And so what that does is, regardless of whether on the organization side, whether my software vendor gave me a software bill of material or not, and whether that was at build time and it changed over time, I can, using Tanium's SBOM, in real time know, right? So think about back the analogy of the ingredients list. Let's say you're making a cake and you put in 10 different ingredients in it, which had their own ingredient list. But at the end of the day, when the cake gets created, what is the bill of material or the ingredient list of the cake of the final product? That's what Tanium SBOM is able to do, that without sort of needing any other SBOM. We can unpack components of software, different suppliers on different endpoints, and say, okay, you want to know log4j version X.Y on which endpoint it is running. It'll immediately give you an inventory on, here are your 11 machines which are running this version of the log4j, regardless of what software it is embedded in, right? We can even recursively look through components. And that becomes really powerful when these vulnerabilities come out, right? You, as a security practitioner that's looking to secure your organization, can instantly understand where your risk exposure is, right? And that's the power of that real-time runtime SBOM, what Tanium is able to deliver.
Okay. All right. So you just hit on the real-time aspect, which I think that trend has existed for a while, going back to the switch from agile to DevOps, and it's just kind of the continuous nature. Like everything in DevOps has the word continuous
Yes.
in it somewhere.
CI/CD. Yes.
And everything's continuous, but that's just part of the shift in culture. Is like that, and because everything's continuous, like that real time becomes more important. Like when 15 years ago, when we were using waterfall development methods and you only put out a product release once every 9 months, I feel like the real-time aspect was less crucial because it wasn't going to change for 9 months. You could do an assessment and know that it was relatively accurate for the next 9 months. But now that the assessment you did this morning might be irrelevant by this evening.
100%. Yeah.
So that real time, and that's one aspect of it. Are there any other, and I don't think there are a ton of SBOM tools out there right now, because I think it's still somewhat nascent. But are there other features or capabilities that you think set apart Tanium's SBOM solution as opposed to other solutions in the market?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tony. And I think this is something that I do want to unpack a little bit with you for our audience here, because there are subtleties here that are really important. So there are other SBOM DevOps tools, I would say, right? So think about the developer community, as you said here, constant, continuous development that goes on. Now, as a software creator, there are tools, and those are the DevOps tools where you can sort of generate SBOM for the software that you're creating. Now, it's important as a software vendor, as you're looking to create SBOMs, you need this tool, and that's where it's really useful. It's important for the software vendor to have an SBOM because, again, if I'm Tanium and I'm creating software and I'm using some open source components like Log4j, for example, if I was using that within my software stack, if there was a vulnerability that gets disclosed, I need to know about it as a software vendor so I can create a patch, a fix for it, and make it available for my customers. That's the software supplier of the house, and that's where we have a DevOps-based SBOM tools that help them create those SBOMs that they can ship with the software. But now let's go back to the organizations that are using the software. For these organizations, those DevOps tools are not really useful because these DevOps tools are creating SBOMs at a point in time, and software, as we know, is dynamic and it's changing. So if you have patches, updates, it may not always be reflecting what's in the application stack. Plus, as a consuming organization, I have software, as we said, from dozens or hundreds of different companies and organizations. So how do I know what's there across these different components. That's where the runtime SBOM really differs from what Tanium offers, right? It doesn't care where your software supplier, where you got the software from, will tell you what's on the endpoint here and now. The other thing, now once you know that, okay, I have a particular vulnerable software here, let's say, or a component here which is vulnerable, what's the next thing we need to do, right? From a security perspective, Tony, the next step is let's go mitigate that risk. Let's go remediate it. Now, if you have a patch from the underlying software supplier, let's say there was a vulnerability in a Microsoft component or an Adobe component, very common pieces of software that we'll find on almost every user's machine, right? You have these organizations that are constantly putting out patches, right? You need to now patch that software. Well, Tanium can do that very easily. Like that's something Tanium does at scale with high degree of accuracy, as one of the remediation options. Like let's go and patch it if there's a patch available. But what if there's no patch available, right? What if it's a 0-day thing and you have no patch? Well, there are other remediation options needed. Well, let's go kill the process. Let's uninstall the software. Let's put the device in quarantine and figure out till we have a patch or some sort of other remediation available. There are a range of different remediation options that you need as a security practitioner when these different vulnerabilities come out, right? If there's a patch, go patch it. If there's no patch, there are, several different things you can do. And that's where the Tanium platform really gives those range of options for organizations to be able to deal with these. Find out where there is a particular piece of software, and let's go sort of take mitigation steps to minimize the risk to the organization.
Okay. I guess in that, carrying that forward, is there, and I know sometimes there's definitely in the cybersecurity industry sensitivity about naming names when it comes to customers, but, so we can be ambiguous if we wish. But is there a real world scenario or a case study that you can share where Tanium's SBOM solution, actually played a pivotal role in an incident, or, kind of what kind of outcomes you observed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are so many of these, and I think we can go back to the Log4j since that was one of the bigger ones. When the Log4j vulnerability hit, right, and everybody was scrambling to figure out where there is exposure in the organizations, for our customers, Tanium customers, it was a game changer. We were very quickly able to roll out this capability, and it was a very early version of SBOM that we had rolled that out a couple of years ago, which built on some of the platform's real-time strength. And that really short-circuited almost weeks and months of work for customers to be able to down to minutes, right? Because these customers are able to run these plain language queries within the Tanium console to say, show me all endpoints with Log4j, and boom, right? They were able to instantly get an inventory of all those Log4j, and we've got a number of customers that were able to leverage that, and that was really big. And then so when we move forward from there, I think another recent example was OpenSSL. There was a major vulnerability that got disclosed with OpenSSL version 3. Between version 3 and 3.06, I believe, was where the issue was. And again, OpenSSL is a very common library that's used by a lot of software because it helps secure communication across two different endpoints, if you will. And with the vulnerability disclosed, anything that would be public internet facing or that the attacker could have access to would leave the organization exposed. Again, with Tanium's SBOM, and by then we had significantly matured our SBOM capabilities with not only just the ability to very quickly identify, but also a range of different remediation options all built into the same platform. We had a large number of our customers that were able to very quickly inventory. Now it turned out the OpenSSL vulnerability itself went, from very high severity to medium severity. Luckily, it wasn't as bad as Log4j, but certainly a lot of our customers were able to leverage that. And I think the more recent one was the curl vulnerability, right? That just came out a few weeks ago. And again, initially it was expected to be very, very devastating, similar to the Log4j. But luckily, by the time the research was completed, its severity was downgraded. Nonetheless, there were certain remote scenarios in which, it could still allow the attacker to gain hold within an environment. And again, our customers were able to very quickly just, find wherever in their environment there was that curl library, and take the right mitigation steps.
Okay, very nice. Tying things a little bit back to CISA requirements and such. I mean, there are, if not now, there definitely will be elements of SBOM that apply to the various compliance standards. I mean that it will be a requirement. So, are there specific features or functions in terms of the Tanium product that will help people meet those compliance requirements?
Yeah, that's a great point, Tony. I think one of the requirements or mandates CISA is making is for companies that are in the public sector organizations, certainly the federal departments, as well as critical infrastructure, right? Like whether it's the pipeline, the utilities, and all kinds of things there, are being required to make sure that they have a comprehensive SBOM in place, right? Again, that's all in readiness of know what you have in an environment so that when things come out with major vulnerabilities disclosed, you're ready to take action, right? You're not scrambling to figure out, whether you have it in your environment and where it might be. And so that mandate is certainly in place now, where all these organizations have to put that practice in place and make sure that they have a SBOM, a comprehensive SBOM across the infrastructure.
Okay. Is there anything, so obviously, if you're using Tanium, you've had the SBOM. Is there anything specific about the way that SBOM is created or whatever that is specific to compliance?
Yeah.
Or is it just having one?
No, you're right. I mean, there are certainly more nuances to having the SBOM, the ability to know exactly, a lot of metadata information about this SBOM, or the details about the software, what version it is, what year and date, the vendor, certainly the library name, all of those sort of different attributes of the SBOM are important to have in place. I think that's the foundational capability, at least from a mandate perspective, that public sector organizations have to have in place. Now, certainly, there are multiple ways you can go about doing it. There is a very long route, which is you try to piece together this SBOM across all your different suppliers and try to keep it updated on an ongoing basis. Because keep in mind, the SBOM in itself is dynamic, right? As we discussed earlier, continuous development continues to keep that componentry dynamic. That list is changing and evolving steadily. And then you have to sort of merge that across all your different suppliers and then know exactly on which endpoint you have it. So for example, Tony, you might have a particular piece of software in your machine, and let's say you and I both work for the same organization. You may have a piece of software machine on your machine that I may not, right? So your machine might be at risk if, let's say, there was a vulnerability against that particular component that's in the software that's running on your machine, and I may not be at risk. So that's the other angle of the requirement here, is just not the software bill of material itself, but also understanding where in the environment it might be there.
Well, and you alluded to earlier, it's also getting down to the specifics of it, because if I just say, hey, there's this vulnerability in log4j, we need to go, we need to address this. Well, that's a so it's still somewhat of a generalization. You need to get down to specific. Okay, but it's this version, this library, this. So it's like even if I had a list and I said, hey, I have these 134 systems in my environment that have log4j. Once I get into the specifics, I might say, okay, but I only have 17 of them that actually are vulnerable. Like only 17 of them actually have this specific version running, and so that part becomes important as well. You need the specifics of the versions, the release dates, et cetera. You need that information at your fingertips. And I think, to the point you just made, that's where some of the the real time and the automation comes into play, where it's like it's not. It's similar to going back to the early days of vulnerability management, where you might run a vulnerability scan every 3 months, and then it was like every month, and then it was like every week. But no matter how quickly you did it, there was always this understanding, like, okay, but as soon as I do that, it's no longer true.
It's already
because
stale.
things are constantly changing. So
Exactly.
it's like it's not enough to do point in time scans. There needs to be a real time automation aspect to it, because things are constantly changing.
Absolutely, Tony. I think one of the things here important is to realize is, even though SBOMs are simply an ingredient list, right? When SBOMs are created, a particular component may not be vulnerable, right? And that's the very nature of these vulnerabilities. They're discovered, over time. And so when the software is created and there's an SBOM and the SBOM gets shipped, that with that particular version and stuff, it's not vulnerable. But by the time you deploy it and it's in use, a vulnerability comes out, right? And that's where you need to know, okay, well, I need to find out where it is and do I have it in my environment? And again, because I think going back to that open source software, it's important, right? Because there's literally what I think millions and millions of these open source free libraries that exist that software developers are using globally. And that just compounds the problem. There are just so many of these, sort of projects out there that are being used that it creates that dynamic challenge. So I think, yes, both having an ingredient list, but then also doing continuous vulnerability assessments is important, right? And we have seen this practice, Tony, right? Like from 15, 20 years ago, the practice of doing vulnerability assessments has existed, right? And even today, a lot of organizations are doing vulnerability scans and assessments only maybe once a week, maybe once in even few weeks, or once a month, or even lower frequency, which is scary, right? Because the pace of these vulnerabilities getting disclosed has only been continuing to go up, right? I think last year alone, there were more than 25,000 different vulnerabilities that were disclosed that needed to be actioned. And of course, not everything needs to be addressed, because if it's on some machine that's really deep inside the network and nobody really has access from the outside world, well, it's not as critical. But anything that's on the edge becomes even more critical, or a user machine, right, that might be directly sort of exposed to it becomes critical. And so in addition to knowing the ingredient list or the SBOM, running more frequent sort of ongoing vulnerability assessments and then very quickly remediating, that's the other bit of it. You have to run assessments, but your process of how you address these vulnerabilities has to evolve. It has to be, you can't have, I run vulnerability assessments, one team's assessing, creates a priority list, opens a ticket, attaches data, sends it off to some other team to inspect, and it's relaying through the system for like days and weeks. That's unacceptable, and it's a really ancient practice. Now you need a way to have seamlessly identify, prioritize, and remediate in a seamless way, right? Through the same platform to really modernize your process of vulnerability management as well.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think we started off kind of saying that this is, the concept of a software bill of materials or bill of materials in and of itself is certainly not new, but the increased focus on SBOM as a cybersecurity mandate or whatever is relatively new. So, I guess, from where you're sitting, are there any trends you think that you see that you think will kind of shape the future of software supply chain security? Like, where are we going?
Yeah, I mean, in my engagement with a lot of security leaders, I hear the concerns around software supply chain risks as one of the top concerns, right? It's certainly something that people feel it's a problem. It's something that keeps us up at night, and yet we don't feel fully prepared to deal with it, right? And as we mentioned, the concept of open source software has really been something that has powered the current digital transformation that's going across all different organizations globally. So that trend is going to be there. We're going to have more and more software, in our work environments in every which way. And so I think the big trend here is going to be getting a grip on the software supply chain, fully understanding what is your software supply chain. I think the actions of CISA, where they're looking to not only just guide public sector organizations and critical infrastructure in better securing by understanding the SBOM, but CISA is also taking an active role in making sure this open source community, we can sort of put some guardrails in place and minimize risks of attackers, poisoning some of that software, right? Because it can happen. Like, let's say I'm a contributor to open source software. My account could get hijacked or compromised, and somebody could be using my account in the, GitHub open source library to inject certain malicious code, right? Which, when the new version of that goes out, everybody, the blast radius is high. We saw that with SolarWinds. We saw that with MoveIt. And so I think that trend of both securing upstream, the software supply chain, understanding your software supply chain, running continuous vulnerabilities, and remediating it, in the most rapid fashion, that's gaining momentum. And I see the more forward-leaning CISOs beginning to adopt that practice within the organizations.
Yeah, a year or two back, I did a podcast, and we talked about the fact that a lot of open source projects. I mean, we know the big name ones, but there's thousands and thousands and thousands of open source projects out there, and a lot of them are just hobby thing. It's something someone did on a weekend because they were bored and they said, hey, you know what, I can create this module that does this thing.
Yeah.
But some of those modules have become like foundational in that they're used across millions of software applications. It just became like hey, this is a great piece of little snippet of code. We're just going to use this.
Yeah.
But the person who created it isn't necessarily actively maintaining it. Like they're not getting paid to do it. They've got a day job. They've got other, they've got families and lives, and so they're not sitting there trying to like keep it secure necessarily. And the conversation we had was about how sometimes those accounts on the GitHub accounts or whatever could be hacked, and the thing is, because that thing is because that component is downloaded 10,000 times a day, it's been downloaded 10,000 times a day for the last 5 years. It's got 5 stars. All of the reviews are stellar. If someone is able to hijack that account, the repercussions are huge and fast, because it's riding on that reputation. It's saying, hey, this is a 5-star thing. Everyone downloads it. But if as the threat actor, you can compromise that, that very quickly becomes a massive supply chain blast radius.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the, the power, right? Like, on one side, it's been such an incredible gift, the ability to sort of unleash this innovation machinery where anybody, like you said, over the weekend, right? Like, the hobbyists can create some very cool pieces of software. And there's just a lot of software developers in millions around the globe that contribute to open source software, right? Just, hey, I build this cool utility, let me contribute it, and my fellow developer anywhere in the world can leverage it, right? And it's sort of that short circuits the whole development process. And that's why in many ways we are seeing, this exponential leap in a lot of the innovations that keep rolling out. But yeah, on the other hand, it leads to the challenge of like, not everybody's maintaining it, keeping it up to date, the risks of hacks, and then that thing just becoming a problem. So I think, and that's why it's a worrisome thing for a lot of the security practitioners. You got to tighten up the controls of from where you're sourcing software, right? And your own developers, where are they pulling stuff down from, right? That needs to be also controlled. But then have a process in place so that you can fully know at any given point in time, what do I have in my environment, right? If should something bad come up. Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, so kind of winding down, but I wanted to ask if you have, I guess, any sort of parting advice for organizations that are, just trying to grasp SBOM and get control of it in their organizations. Are there key considerations or best practices? Just advice in general for like what should organizations be doing in terms of leveraging SBOM as a strategic cybersecurity tool, or just getting on top of things?
Yeah. No, I think I can help sort of quickly summarize it. So look, I think for anybody who works in the security space, you know it, that you can't really protect what you can't really see, right? So visibility is the foundational capability. SBOMs give you visibility on your software supply chain, right? So make sure that you get a capability in your environment that allows you to, at any given point in time, understand what is your software supply chain, right? And what are the different components across all your IT estate that have the different components of the software supply chain. So that's number one. Ensure you have comprehensive visibility in place that can be automatically ideally generated, not something that you have to have an army of people or a few heads dedicated to doing it. Needs to be efficient. And there is tooling in place today, right? So Tanium certainly one of the examples there. So that's visibility. The other thing is run, and Tony, you and I chatted about this. So first, visibility. Second, do continuous assessments of the vulnerabilities, right? As these vulnerabilities get disclosed and they get CVEs attached to it, that's where your vulnerability assessments can certainly help, right? Identify, okay, not only I know what software I have, but now I know which ones of these are vulnerable, right? And you, based on the asset criticality, you can go take remediation steps. And not only that, within the vulnerable ones, you can also identify which ones are being, actively exploited, the known exploited vulnerabilities, as we call it. Within Tanium, we have that additional flag that helps customers prioritize it automatically based on the asset criticality and also what's being actively exploited. So I think that's another great best practice. Know what you have, keep continuously scanning at a high frequency for vulnerabilities. The other thing is there's a lot of these, and it's not as high frequency, thankfully, right? 0-day vulnerabilities or emerging threats as they come out that may not even have a CVE number associated with it.
Right.
It's important to keep track of that. And there is, again, ways to do that for our customers within Tanium. We have a way where what we call emerging issues on the console itself. We'll alert customers, hey, we see this emerging threat in the wild. We automatically create a report, a sensor, as we call it, for our customers that allows them to see within their environment what is impacted and allow customers to take mitigation steps within our platform. But again, typically what organizations will do, you'll have your word team that's going to go do research, figure out what this threat is, and then figure out if it's applicable to your environment. It's a lot of heavy lift. But again, putting that best practice in place where you can keep an eye on emerging threats, understand it's impacting the environment, and be ready to take mitigation steps is important, right? And keep looking for automated toolings that can make your lives easier, from a resourcing and complexity and cost perspective. So I think those are the three things: visibility, continuous assessments, keeping an eye on emerging sort of threats, and a way to sort of automate visibility and actionability against those.
All right, very good. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time. I think it was a fun conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tony. Yeah, I think this topic of SBOM, it's such a timely and a good one, and hopefully our audience was going to find it useful. And I do really appreciate you having me on the show. This was really fun.
All right, thank you.
I appreciate you investing your time to listen to the podcast, but I also invite you to engage on social media. Please go like our Facebook page and follow at TechSpective on Twitter and Instagram. You can feel free to let me know what you like, let me know what you don't like, let me know if you love it, let me know if it sucks, and let me know what products you'd like to see reviewed or what questions you'd like to see answered in future posts.